Thank you. It's good to see all of you tonight. Before we start the message, if you need translated into Chinese, the sermon translated into Chinese, please raise your hand. Maybe someone should say it in Chinese.
Come on, Michael, practice.
I don't know how to say translated sheep. 如果你要在意 举手，谢谢。All right, what I want to do tonight is we're going to be in Genesis 38, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to read almost all of the chapter. So if you have your Bible or your phone or some way to read that, please pull that out, go to Genesis 38. And we'll read the whole, we'll read most of it. And I just wanted to tell you at the beginning that this is not a happy story. Okay, there is hope at the end, but there's a lot of sin in this chapter. Okay? So remember that when we read things in the Bible that are sinful, it's not that God is saying do this. He's just saying these are real people. I'm still going to do what I'm going to do. Okay, so we're going to read Genesis 38, and then we'll pray, and then we'll study it together. So Genesis 38. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Harah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite woman, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son. And he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend, Harah the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me, that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to take back to the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the man of the place, "Where is the cold prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cold prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also the man of the place said, "No cold prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. Pray. Father, this is a tremendously sobering passage. God, the ease with which Judah fell into horrible sin, God, serves as a warning. I pray, God, that as we study this passage and as we read and pray and listen, that we would take seriously your call to follow you, that we would not turn to the right or to the left, to the temptations and the ways of thinking that are in the world, but God, that we would fix our eyes on you, Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, and that we would not stray away from you. And Father, as I pray that, I confess that task is too much for us. We don't have the strength to do that. And yet you do, and you promise to give it to us. So God, I pray that even as we study some sober things, that you would fill us with faith and hope that your will for us is not to be like Judah. Rather, your will is that we would love you and obey you and follow you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. What we want to do tonight is look at the story of Judah and Tamar, and we want to ask one simple, overarching question. The question is this: how should we respond to God's plan? Because sometimes God's will doesn't make sense to us, or it's not what we want to do, or sometimes we might not even just know what it is. So the question, and really we're going to get two answers from this week and next week. The question is, how should God's people respond to his will? How should we obey him? Tonight will mostly be a very bad example. In fact, most of tonight is, you want to obey God? You want to love God? Do the opposite of what Judah does. Next week, we'll look at a good example from Joseph. So one way to kind of understand what's going on here is to see these two stories of Judah and Tamar, and then of Joseph, as two opposite examples, two sides of the coin. One a bad example, one a good example. The story of Judah and Tamar takes place while Joseph is in Egypt. You remember last week Todd preached on Joseph being sold into slavery. And while he goes down there and is with Potiphar and all the things that happen to him, there's still life going on back with his family. And so the story of Judah happens while Joseph is going down to Egypt. The end of chapter 38 says that the Midianites took Joseph down and sold him as a slave to Potiphar. And then the first verse in chapter 39 says Potiphar bought Joseph. And so Moses, the writer of Genesis, puts right in the middle of this story this strange and sad tale of Judah and Tamar. We have to ask why. Why do we want to know what happens to Joseph. That's the exciting part, right? Why, Moses, would you do that? There's a lot of reasons, but I think one main one is simply to remind us that even though we are calling this Joseph's story, it's not actually Joseph's story. This is actually God's story. And even though the drama of the brothers is amazing and we learn a lot, there's a bigger story going on as well. So you would never pick up a book and just read a chapter and say, I know the whole story. You'd never watch a movie, start 15 minutes in, watch 10 minutes and say, okay, I know the movie. Right? That's not what we do. And so I just want to take 2 or 3 minutes and remind us of the overarching story that this little slice of story is in. So, give me just 2 or 3 minutes. We'll do a quick summary of the history of the Bible. God created the world. It was good. And Adam and Eve sinned. And they had children who sinned, and the population increased. And people forgot about God. And they were wicked. They grew wicked in their hearts. They grew sinful in their hearts. They were so bad, in fact, that God sent a flood, destroyed the whole world, saved Noah and his family. After Noah and his family were saved, they again began to spread out, but God did something at the Tower of Babel. He gave them different languages. And it's very interesting historically. Before that, they were one people. After the Tower of Babel, they became many different peoples. They had their own languages. And so they spread apart, and they developed their own cultures. And people's identities. Who am I? I am a Philistine. I am an Edomite. I am an Egyptian. They took on a new identity that they had never had before, and that was a people. And this was part of God's plan, because God was planning to make for himself his own people who would not identify primarily by language, primarily by culture, but whose primary identity would be, we are the children, the people of God. We will follow God. And so God started that with Abraham. He revealed himself to Abraham, and he said, go to a land I will show you. It's an overlooked detail, but it's so important. God said, go away. He reveals himself to Abraham. He says, you're going to get to know me, the real living God. Go away, of course, because if he reveals himself to Abraham and leaves him surrounded by these people who worship idols, who engage in all sorts of wicked behavior, Abraham is going to have a hard time knowing and serving and worshiping God. And so God says, leave. It's going to be a huge theme in this story. Leave. And Abraham and Sarah had Isaac, and Isaac met God. And Isaac and his wife Rebekah had Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God. And then Jacob had these 12 sons that we read about last week. These are going to become the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. And the people of Jacob and Isaac and Abraham are going to go down to Egypt. They're going to follow Joseph down into Egypt. And they're going to be enslaved and captured by the Egyptians for 400 years. And at that point, it would have been very tempting for them to say, God, what are you doing? But you know, Joseph being sold to Egypt and the family following him and the slavery after that was not an accident. In Genesis 15, listen to what God tells Abraham. The Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners, travelers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there, and they will be afflicted, persecuted for 400 years. It will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward the people shall come out with great possessions. God told Abraham, look, I'm going to make you great, but there's going to be 400 years where you are going to be enslaved by another country. There's a lot that happens with the story of the Exodus, but one reason I think God did that, we see in Judah and Tamar. Because Judah shows us what happens when you're surrounded by wickedness. More likely than not, you become like the people around you. And do you know, when God took the people into Egypt and made them slaves, they grew from a family of several hundred into a people of possibly several million. And yet, because they were slaves and persecuted, they kept the identity as the people of God. God's not running around after Joseph gets sold down into slavery and, oh no, what do I do? All of this, you have to know, all of this is God's plan. And we also have to know that Judah would have heard about God's plan. This is a theme all throughout the Bible. Be separate to me, God says. Don't be like the people around you. Be devoted to me. In fact, in James 1:27, we're going to come back to this verse, so listen carefully. He says, religion, in other words, the true worship of God, that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this. You want to know worship that pleases God? Visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keep yourself unstained from the world. The worship that pleases God is when his people do not act like the sinful people around them. They keep themselves clean and unstained from the world. Tonight we'll see an example of Judah who definitely did not do this. It's a horrible example. In fact, we already saw part of it, right? Judah already has rejected God's plan. When it became clear that God was giving leadership in the family to Joseph, who, by the way, was Judah's much younger brother, Judah said no. Judah was not the oldest brother. There were 3 older than him that would have been the honored sons, right? That would have been likely to receive the inheritance and the blessing. But the 3 older ones had disgraced themselves. And so Judah's probably thinking, I do this right, I can move up and get my father's favor and be the main guy in this family. He was thinking, he was trying to advance himself. And then God gives Joseph these dreams. God says, Joseph, the young brother, is going to be the leader. She's thinking, what? There's no way. It's interesting that Judah is the one who thought of selling Joseph to the Egyptians. Judah's thinking, one move, I can get back into the favored position, and I can make a little money. So when he sells Joseph, he is saying to God, God, I do not like your plan. I'm selling Joseph. So much for your plan. You failed. I win. So already we see Judah responding to God's will horribly, only looking for himself. As we go through this story in Genesis 38, we're going to see 3 primary sins of Judah, although there's a lot in there. 3 primary sins of Judah. So, let's look at it. In chapter 38, 39, at the beginning, it says that after Joseph was sold into slavery, Judah went down from his brothers and chose to live with the Canaanites. This is not just a trip, right? He moves himself down there. He marries a woman from the Canaanites, even though his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had found wives within the people of God. Judah takes a wife from the Canaanites. When I say Canaanites, that's the people who lived in the land who did not know God. So he took a wife from the Canaanites, and he grew his children up there. You know, in America, people spend, and I think here in Taiwan, people spend a lot of time thinking about what school they want their kids to go to. Right? So people will actually, I know people who, they'll move when their kids are in elementary school, they'll move to a district with a really good elementary school. And then when their kids get older, they'll move to a different part of the city that has a better middle school. And then they'll move again so their kids can go to a better high school, right? Judah chooses to live and raise his kids in the Canaanite culture. He's not back with his brothers. He's moved away. He's not in the family of God. He's surrounded by the world. You might say, well, come on. I mean, of course. They had just had this huge fight. They stole their brother and lied to their dad about it. They all hated each other. Of course, they didn't give him a break. Judah knew, even if he didn't believe, he had heard that the descendants of Abraham were God's people and that God would bless them. So to say, well, it made sense that he would go down there is not okay. You know, the words, well, it makes sense, can be very dangerous words. Well, it makes sense that I would do that thing that doesn't honor God. It makes sense. It's logical. Look, friends, God will call us to do things that do not make sense. So the main lesson, here it is. Here's the main lesson from this whole story. The main response that we should have to God's will, regardless of whether we understand it or agree with it, the main response that his people should have is this: we should trust him and obey him. Of course, there's room for legitimate, God, what do you want? Of course, there's time to process. But when it comes to the end of the day, God's people, when they understand God's will, they trust God, they say, okay, and they obey. And that is exactly what Judah does not do. Can I pause just for a minute here and just talk about one of the things that can influence us negatively? And so, if you are not married, this is for you. So often, let me say it this way: be very careful who you will allow your heart to fall in love with. Because it's very tempting to meet someone who's not a Christian, but they're really a nice guy or really a nice girl. And you know, in the Old Testament, God ended up telling the Jews, don't marry Gentiles. In the New Testament, he repeats the command, except it's not Gentiles now, it's people that are not Christians. And can I just tell you, I have seen firsthand people who marry someone who is not a Christian, and they think, I'm going to lift that person up, and that person will be a better person. And almost always, what ends up happening is the Christian gets pulled into the world and loses their testimony and sins and walks away from the Lord. So just be very careful. And I know that most of you, especially if you're Taiwanese, do not have a lot of people outside of this church who are Christians. And so you're thinking, okay, Michael, if I don't marry a non-Christian, there's a possibility that I would never get married, ever, because I just don't know any other people that are Christians. I know that's the reality. So can I just say, God's will doesn't always make sense, but the call is still to obey it. And God will honor you. I can't promise that he'll honor you with a spouse, but he will honor your faithfulness and your obedience on earth and even more in heaven. Parents, what kinds of examples are you holding up for your children? You say, oh, look at that person. They make a lot of money. They're really cute. You should think about dating them. Or are you training your children to wait and look for a godly spouse who will encourage them in the ways of the Lord instead of pulling them down? Judah went and found the spouse for his oldest son, Her name was Tamar, and she was a Canaanite. And to be honest, not much of this story is her fault. She was acting exactly how everyone else around her acted. Most of the fault here lies with Judah. So and Judah get married. And yet, before they're able to have children, God kills for his wickedness. You know, in the story of Joseph, this is the first time God is mentioned. Something to think about. The first time God is directly mentioned here is when he's putting to death Judah's son for his wickedness. The passage doesn't tell us what he did or how God killed him, just that he was exceedingly wicked. And now we have the son of Judah, a son of Israel, so wicked that God kills him. Now, this presents a problem. And to totally understand this problem, we have to understand a little bit about this time period. So in those days, having children was very important, especially having sons. And for a woman to have a son was important for three reasons. First of all, the inheritance generally passed through the firstborn son, although there is record also in the Old Testament of it passing to daughters when there were no sons. But Tamar had no children. No son, no children. So, no inheritance. The second is, usually it was the men who would go out and work, The women stayed and worked closer to home. The men would go out in the field and work. And probably for a while, Tamar could have gone out and collected grain and fed herself. But what about when she gets old? She has no young children, no sons to go out and work in the fields for her. So down the road, she's going to be in poverty. And third, there was a great and real honor in having children and adding to the prosperity of the family by adding children to the family. And so Tamar lost that honor. And so when God killed Tamar is left with no possibility of an inheritance, because when she marries Judah's family, she will no longer get an inheritance from her father. She'll get an inheritance from her husband's father. So no inheritance, no provision, no honor. Left as a widow. Now, at the time, there was a system in place to deal with this. In fact, shortly after this in history, God actually writes this system into law. It was a way to care for women who were in this position. The system is a little strange to us, but it's what God did to care for people in this situation. This was it. So, dies. What should happen is the next unmarried brother should marry Tamar. Onan should marry Tamar. The first son that they have will be son. He will carry name. And that way he will get inheritance, the family line will continue, he will take care of his mother. Then, the other children in that marriage between Onan and Tamar will be Onan and Tamar's children. But the first son would be and Tamar's son. This was a way to provide for the women who were widows at the time. Well, Onan does not want to do this. Probably he didn't want to share the inheritance with him. We don't know, but it says he didn't want the son to be so either he hated or he did not want to share the inheritance, and so he took measures when he slept with Tamar to make sure she did not get pregnant. I want to say a very quick thing here. Some groups, specifically, I don't mean to step on toes, but I'm going to step on toes. Specifically, the Catholic Church says that this passage teaches that birth control is a sin. It's such a sin that God kills Onan for it. Can I tell you, there is a horrible sin in here, but it's not the sin of birth control. The sin in here, and God kills Onan for this behavior. He killed he kills Onan. And the horrible behavior is that Onan had no compassion. He had no desire to care for his sister-in-law, who was now impoverished and shamed. She had no options. She's destitute, really, for the rest of her life. And Onan looks at her and says, "Yeah, but I don't get as much money." Remember the verse we read in James? True religion in the eyes of God is to keep yourself unstained from the world. But you know what it says before that? True religion in the eyes of God is to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep yourself unstained from the world. This is so close to God's heart, to care for the people in need, especially in God's people, that God kills Onan for his wicked heart. You know, I can't help but notice that Judah cared nothing for Joseph, his brother. And Judah's son, Onan, cared nothing for Tamar, his sister-in-law. Like father, like son, we say in the U.S. Parents, I know, because I'm a parent, that we will pass on bad habits and sinful patterns to our children. My question for us is, what are we doing to pass the fear of God onto our children? The instruction in the Lord onto our children to fight against their sinful desires? What are we doing? We're talking a lot about this at the leadership level. We have some ideas, but let me just challenge you. The best thing to give your children is not career advice. It's the Bible. Sin number 2. Has been killed. No baby. Onan has been killed. No baby. Judah looks at his last, his third son, and says, yikes, if I give him to Tamar, is he gonna die too? So he says to Tamar, okay, here's what we're gonna do. You go back to your father's house, you live as a widow for a while. When my third son, Shelah, grows up, gets old enough, come, you two will get married and we'll try it again. So Tamar leaves, goes to her father's house, and this completely changed her position in society. She had to wear different clothing, her widow's clothing, her role in society completely changed. And so he just says, go, I don't know how long it'll be. And he just leaves her. It's horrible. Years pass, and Judah's second sin is that he lies and breaks his word to Tamar. He's more worried about his own name and his own family than he is what God's will is, which is to care for the people around him. So God's will was to serve Joseph. He didn't do that. God's will was for him to stay with God's people. He didn't do that. God's will was to care for the needy and the weak in his midst. He did not do that. You see how time after time he knows God's will and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. It's not convenient for me. It's not helpful to me. Time passes. Judah's wife dies. He grieves for a while, and then the time of the year comes when they shear the sheep. And Judah goes up to Timnah. Shearing sheep is when the wool grows out, and they cut the wool off, and then they sell the wool, and it's good. It makes a profit for them, okay? So it's time to cut the wool off all the sheep, and Judah goes to Timnah. We think, okay, that's pretty logical. It's not. Actually, this time of year for the Canaanite culture was a time of wild partying. It was a time of offerings to idols, drinking, gluttony, and giving yourself to many temple prostitutes. This was a wild, wicked, gluttonous party that they were going up to. Notice it says that Judah went up with his friend, Haran. It doesn't say he went up with his business partner. He went up with his buddy to party. So Judah has gotten to the point, he has walked away from God's will, so that there is absolutely no difference in the life of Judah than the life of the people around him. There is such a warning here for us. A stunning, scary warning for us. And this is, I think, one of the reasons I said it, why God sends his people into slavery. He's protecting them from the likelihood that they would all do this. You see how even the slavery he sends them into ends up being good for them. It's so dangerous for us. So please hear me very clearly. Around you and around me, in culture, are lots of ideas that do not come from the Bible. And you need to know that every idea that is not from the truth of the Bible is designed, it's planned to keep you and other people from knowing God. Now, it might not be that the person who tells you the bad idea or the bad advice is trying to keep you from God. But in 2 Corinthians, it says our battle is against speculations and arguments and ideas and false beliefs. You see, Todd preached a few weeks ago on the devil like a roaring lion. And it's true that the devil wants to attack us with sins so that we fall on our faces. But it is more dangerous if the devil gets us to believe an idea that is not from the Bible. Because then we might think we are doing good, and we are really walking farther and farther away from God. So let me give you one example that I could think of, and I think it's common in Taiwan and in America, although it shows itself a little bit differently. One example. Think about what culture tells us about what life is about. Often, what we hear now is life is about being comfortable. Do what you can to make your life comfortable. I like being comfortable. I like turning on the AC when it's hot, right? I like getting in my car and being able to turn on the AC or having a nice cold glass of water. Comfortable is not bad. But the idea is comfort is what life is about. And so we say, okay, good. And then what we do is we think, I have to get the best job I can. It's okay. So I can make a lot of money. Also okay. So I can get new toys and more comfort and provide for my family better and better things and travel to farther and farther places away and take new hobbies that cost more money. And pretty soon, our life is entirely, every minute is about pursuing comfort and physical wealth. Whereas the Bible says, no, life is about simplicity. And we pass on our blessings to the work of the gospel and to the people who need it. And yet that idea is completely counter to be comfortable at all costs. And if you pursue comfort, or if you pursue success by doing bye-bye, or success by cheating on your business partners, you are walking farther and farther away from God and more into culture. Judah fell hard into believing and acting like the culture around him. What happens next? So tragic. Judah's third sin, the last point. Tamar realizes that Judah is not going to give him or give her a husband. Shelah has grown up, and Tamar has not made the offer. So she says, well, I'm going to do whatever I can to get a child. She hears that Judah is going up to Timnah. She knows, sadly, she knows what kind of man Judah is. She knows this will work. So she takes off her widow's clothes. She goes ahead of him, disguises herself as a prostitute, and sits next to the road before the city where Judah is going to. So Judah's going up to Timnah, ready for his party time. First prostitute that he sees is Judah, outside the town. Or not Judah, Tamar, outside the town. And he's like, oh, great, party starts early. So he propositions her, he asks her for sex. You know, he does this as easily as we get on a bus or get a taxi. She's like, yeah, sure, this will work. Tamar's not a fool. She says, okay, you have to pay me. He says, well, I'll send a goat. I don't have it here, I'll send it. She says, okay, you have to give me a promise so that you'll actually send the payment. He says, well, what? She says, give me the seal that you wear on the cord around your neck and your staff. So his walking staff would have been very unique to him. It would have been identifiable. He puts his hand right there, it's worn right there, it has this scratch from the time he fell, and it's his staff. And then the seal was very much like what we use in Taiwan as a chop. Right? It's what he would sign or stamp legal documents with. So basically, Tamar says, okay, give me your credit cards, all your credit cards, give me your chop or your social security number, and we can go at it. He's like, okay, sounds good to me. Right? So he uses her, he leaves, she takes off and runs home and puts on her widow's clothes again. Later, Judah sends someone with the goat. They look, they don't find her. They ask, no, there's no prostitute here. And Judah says, look, we better not keep pursuing this because people will figure out what we're doing and they'll laugh at us. So he's like, okay, well, it's fine. We'll just hope that she just puts that away. 3 months later, word comes to Judah, Tamar is pregnant. Your daughter-in-law is pregnant. Worse than that, she's pregnant by prostitution. Judah has not thought about her at all. And now, when she threatens to shame his family, he reacts. The chilling words bring her out to be burned. Judah, the son of Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham, who was God's friend. Judah has walked into the culture of sin, and now, like that, is ready to burn to death his daughter-in-law without listening to her side, without thinking about the child within her. He's fallen far. Imagine the scene. The men run to the tent. They rip open the tent and they say, "Tamar, today you die for your sin. We're going to burn you." And they're dragging her out. And somehow she manages to grab the staff and the seal, maybe gives them to a friend, and says, "Run to Judah. Tell Judah that the father of my child owns these." And they're dragging her out to be burned, and the friend or the servant runs to Judah and shows the staff and the seal to Judah and says, "The father of Tamar's child owns these." And Judah has to be shocked. He sees his staff where he used to hold it, just right there. The seal with his cord that gets sweaty and dirty from being around his neck. He knows that he is about to kill Tamar for a sin, but what he has done to her is much worse. He calls off the execution. And I think this is a turning point for Judah. He acknowledges his sin. God opens his eyes to see his sin, and he says, "She is more righteous than I. I sinned against her." And I think it's a turning point because not too long into the future, Judah and his brothers are going to go down to Egypt. We'll pick up the story of Joseph again. And they'll go down to Egypt, and Judah will make a plea to save a brother of his. And he confesses his sin against Joseph, and he offers himself. I think this moment with Tamar is when he realizes, what have I become? What have I become? It's good when God shows us our sin. Do you know that? It's good. When God shows us sin, most of the time what we want to do is hide from God. But he shows us our sin not to shame us, but so that we can come back to him. God will take you back. You say, well, I don't know, really? Let's look at the last few verses to prove. This is just stunning. The best is definitely last here. The last few verses in Genesis 38 say this. When the time for her labor came, there were twins in her womb, and she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Zerah. Isn't that amazing? Let me read one other passage that will inform this, that will explain this to us. This is Matthew chapter 1. This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So Matthew is going to list the people in the ancient line of Jesus. If you want to think about an honored place to have, it is to be one of the members of Jesus' family. Right? The King of the world, the Savior of the world. What greater honor could you have than to be one of his ancestors? So here it is. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. These wicked people. Judah, this wicked man. Tamar, crafting a plan to become pregnant by her father-in-law. These wicked people are in Jesus' family line. A place of great honor. How can this be true? You would think that God would pick the best, the wisest, the most powerful, the strongest, the richest, and he would make those part of his family line. No, he picks Judah Tamar, who were sinful beyond belief. He says, I'm going to put them in my family line. They will be my family. We said at the beginning that this is not Joseph's story. This is not Judah's story. This is God's story. Jesus says in Hebrews 12 that he is not ashamed to call us his brothers and sisters, in spite of our sin. Friends, God is not the God of the perfect people. If you're broken, if you have shame, if you have sin, this is the place for you. God is the God of the broken. The people who say, I can't. So I'm going to go to somebody who can. And we turn to God. That's what Christianity is. We cannot. God can. If you are a Christian, one of the hardest things to do, because we should know better than to sin, right? One of the hardest things to do is to be honest about sin. And let me just tell you, this is a place where you can be honest about sin as a Christian. It doesn't matter. God wants you to come back. Like Judah repented, you're not going to be worse than Judah. And even if you are, God's grace covers all of it. The last lesson, this is what I'm going to close with, to how to respond to God's plan is, if you have rejected God's plan, if you have abandoned God's plan, the right answer always is to repent. It's not to try and make it better. It's not to get yourself looking good enough, and then you can kind of come back and fake it some more. The right answer, if you have walked away from God's plan, is to repent. And friends, we do this every day in small ways. Always, the Christian life is repenting and coming back to God, and repenting and coming back to God. And I just pray that you don't have to go through what Judah went through. You can just say, if you're a Christian, God, what have I done? How have I walked away from you in big ways or small ways? And he'll tell you. He wants you close to himself. If you have not become a Christian, where else are you going to find a God that does not shame you for your sin, but welcomes you into his family? You're not going to find it anywhere else. This is what you need. If you want to be part of God's family, talk to Todd or talk to me tonight. So Judah responded to God's great plan by walking away from it. And yes, he repented, but there were consequences. Next week we'll see an example of Joseph who did not respond this way. So how do we respond? By trusting and obeying God. But we're not going to do that perfectly. So the second way we respond to God is by repenting and coming back to him. Time after time after time. Let's pray.